Hello everyone, Dr. Eames here. What I'd like to talk about this time is just a few brief remarks on the early management pioneers and the state of management as a profession before we got our first theories. Um, what we have found through research is that many different theorists and academics and people interested in the new budding emerging field of management had similar ideas both on the European continent, in the UK, and the US. The biggest problem was these ideas weren't necessarily shared with each other because things were not translated quickly, so one researcher might be writing in French or German or another in English, and generally it took quite a few years for these ideas to get back and forth. But what we find is that many people were thinking the same things. What we had at this time, and we're talking about the 19th century, the 1800s in particular, is when we saw the rise of factories and really a change in life in Western civilization in general, where people began to move from an agrarian lifestyle to the urban centers where there were factories and indeed factory towns and jobs and so forth. And so life was quite different. The thing to remember during this time is that we had no laws at all to govern how laborers were treated in the workplace. There was no health insurance, no liability, no safety, no laws governing what minors could do and what minors couldn't. And remember, women didn't even get the right to vote until well into the beginning of the 20th century. So even then, the females were considered second-class citizens, and indeed in the early factories, females were much sought after as workers because they were deemed more compliant than men and so forth. And as far as children went, there were no restrictions on the age of children, the sorts of hazardous duties they might do, and so forth. So there was no real protection for the worker. At the same time we had this situation, we did have a lot of thinkers and people involved in various factories and production, wherever they might be located, saying, this is just not working out. We're not doing anything in a methodical, scientific sort of fashion, and things did seem to be very inefficient. So we had these early thinkers talking about these ideas in their own countries and spreading what they thought was the way to go on how to handle people. And as yet, we didn't really have an official profession of management until about the turn of the 20th century, when it seemed to be apparent that managers were a profession and stood on their own and so forth. Well, it takes theories and a foundation and some sort of research to establish a real profession, like we have with, say, engineers and doctors and educators and things like that. And so managers eventually got their due as society was changing and these ideas became to the forefront. What is interesting about the early theorists, and I'm just going to talk about two of them here, Robert Owen and Charles Babbage, was that they were talking about ideas that ended up really as part of the behavioral management theory, which is a theory or two down the road. But what it does show us is that these ideas about people and how to work with people and indeed the worth of the individual were being talked about and so forth and studied in Western civilization in general. So our first early management pioneer, before we had our first theory of how to be a manager and what management was about, is Robert Owen. Now, he was born about the time of the Revolutionary War and he lived till about the beginning of the Civil War. He was British, he was an industrialist, and he worked in factories and so forth in the UK, and he's one of the first managers to mention in writing and with his talks that, the human resource seems to be very important, much more important than we're giving it in our factories, and that maybe we would all succeed and do much better in business if we paid attention to the welfare of the workers. So Robert Owen's contribution to this early management thinking was he sought improvement in factories and domestic conditions even for his employees. So he went beyond just the conditions at work, but with his thinking that we needed some sort of social reforms. And so he was operating in the textile mill industry. He created model communities with educational reforms in place and so forth. One of the things that Owen said was that his objective was not to be just a mere manager of cotton mills, but to introduce some sort of legitimate principles in the conduct of people. And what he was talking about here was the relationships between managers and workers. The second theorist I'd like to talk about is Charles Babbage. He was born in 1792, so a couple of years after the Constitution was verified, and we really became a country. Well, by that time, we did have many factories, mostly textile industry factories, all throughout the country, and he lived through through the end of the Civil War or so. He was also British. He was a mathematician at Cambridge University, and he wrote an influential book on the economy of machinery and manufacturing. His contribution is that he looked and saw the factories in England and France and said, there is no logical way to the way work is being planned for the future, that everything is being done using estimates or any influential person's idea of what was the best way to go. Well, certainly that is not efficient, and that is not really very productive. And too many real decisions were being made using creative imagination and so forth. So his real point was that factory labor was not being used scientifically. He has stressed, really, that good machines and very efficient workers do not ensure success in the marketplace, and that we should have good management that directs and controls the machines and the workers both. So he suggested that time and motion studies are the techniques that maybe we could use the best to figure out the most efficient ways to do things. One other interesting thing about Charles Babbage was that he was the inventor of the first mechanical computer. And you can see the slide and a picture of him in the presentation I've got for you. And he made several prototypes, 3 or 4 of this machine. It operated and would do very high-level mathematical computations of the day, but he had trouble finding backers to produce the thing. People at the time just couldn't see the use for something that did these sorts of computations. Okay, that's all I have to talk about this time. I'll pick it up again with classical management perspective in the next one.